Order!
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen. Amen.
Good afternoon, members. Minister's statement. Minister Acknowledgments, the Minister of Health and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to provide members with an update on the draft Child and Family Services Quality Improvement Plan. The Quality Improvement Plan sets out actions that we are taking right now to address issues identified as part of internal reviews and the 2018 Auditor General's report and from staff feedback. The Quality Improvement Plan extends the work that was started under Building Stronger Families and refocuses our efforts in those areas where it is needed most. It reinforces what has already been achieved, ensures outstanding items are completed, and addresses additional gaps that were found. The plan responds directly to the Auditor General's recommendation to develop a detailed action plan that clearly sets out how we will ensure that the Children and Family Services system will operate in compliance with legislation. Mr. Speaker, the plan contains key actions that will allow us to better manage, resource and structure our system to ensure that significant changes achieved through the Building Stronger Families Action Plan can be sustained. It identifies 4 strategic directions to improve the Child and Family Services system, including continuing to build a culture of quality, investing in human resources, building staff capacity, and engaging with our partners. As part of the Quality Improvement Plan, we have already taken important steps in each of these areas. To meet the goal of the plan, the government has proposed a new investment of $3.3 million to add positions to support child and family services. We've already completed an initial caseload analysis and have started a territory-wide recruitment campaign for frontline staff. We have also set up quality reviews for closed investigations, foster care services, and minimum contact requirements. We have clarified roles and responsibilities for out of the territory program and have established a system to monitor the interprovincial placement agreements and courtesy supervision for out of territory placements. Mr. Speaker, with the renewed focus of the Quality Improvement Plan, we have also implemented a revised accountability framework and established a guardianship standard tool and checklist. We've established a training team and completed additional training for staff, supervisors, managers, and assistant directors. We've created a quality committee and working groups, implemented monthly staff teleconferences, and set up an assistant directors forum. Mr. Speaker, engagement is one of the strategic directions of the Quality Improvement Plan. Working collaboratively with our partners and receiving ongoing feedback is crucial to ensure that we are moving in the right direction to improve the quality of child and family services and are supporting our staff and partners adequately through this process. While our team continues to work on the priority areas of the Quality Improvement Plan, over the coming months we will work with key stakeholders to further refine the plan and receive valuable feedback on the implementation of specific actions. This is a living document, Mr. Speaker, and will change over time as actions are completed and new actions are identified as needing focused attention to be addressed. For example, once publicly released, the Department of Health and Social Services will review carefully the recommendations made by the Standing Committee on Government Operations in relation to the Auditor General's 2018 report, and these recommendations will inform revisions of the Quality Improvement Plan and its implementation. In addition, we have reached out to Indigenous governments to request a meeting with them to discuss their priorities and how we can work together to strengthen child and family services across the Northwest Territories. This feedback will also help shape the Quality Improvement Plan and the implementation of specific action items. Mr. Speaker, we remain committed to taking action to improve our child and family services system, and our #1 priority will continue to be the well-being and safety of children and youth in our care. The Auditor General's report and our own internal audits has shown that there are areas that need focused and better resourced attention to continue to build on the promise of building stronger families. With our Living Quality Improvement Plan, we will continue to work with members of the Legislative Assembly, Child and Family Services staff, communities, Indigenous leaders, other partners, and families we serve to make the changes we need for a stronger child and family services system in the North. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statement. Minister Ike Godani, the Minister responsible for public engagement and transparency.
Mr. Speaker, in recognition of Global Open Government Week, I would like to take this opportunity to update this House on our government's progress in advancing our mandate commitments for increasing government transparency and accountability. 1 year ago, Mr. Speaker, I stood on this floor and announced the release of our government's open government policy. The policy represented an important step toward fulfilling our government's pledge to greater openness and transparency. Mr. Speaker, the open government policy committed our government to develop directives and guidelines to improve the way we share information and data and how we acquire and use feedback from residents from public engagements. All ministers are accountable under the policy to ensure that their departments and agencies follow these directives and guidelines and to take further actions to increase openness and transparency. Since the open government policy was launched a year ago, an interdepartmental working group has worked to develop one of the major commitments of the open government policy, a common approach to public engagement for our government. The approach has since been piloted within the government, and I am pleased to announce today that it has been launched to the public. Engaging with the public on issues of importance and interest to them is vital to advancing the principles of open government, Mr. Speaker. That is why the common approach we have developed consists of a number of elements and resources, including a step-by-step guide for employees planning public engagement activities, updated web resources, and a common online approach that provides a central listing of all public engagement opportunities and an advisory committee to build capacity and a community of practice among our government staff. Mr. Speaker, I want to encourage all members of this House and N.W.T. residents to visit the Open Government website and learn more about the Government of the Northwest Territories' common approach to public engagement. It is my hope that residents will embrace this new approach to engagement with our government and will make their voices known through their participation. Mr. Speaker, as we approach the end of the 18th Legislative Assembly, I am proud of the progress that our government has made to increase government accountability and transparency. While we recognize that improving the way we share data and information and engage with residents is an ongoing process, not a destination, our government remains committed to this process and to fulfilling our mandate commitments in this area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Kamloops.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to rise today on the occasion of Commonwealth Day, the annual celebration of the Commonwealth of Nations, observed by roughly 2.4 billion people in 53 countries around the world, spread over every continent and ocean. The day will be celebrated with a broad range of activities, including faith and civic gathering, debates, school assemblies, flag-raising ceremonies, street parties, cultural events, and a multicultural, multi-faith service at Westminster Abbey, where the head of the Commonwealth, our Sovereign, Her Majesty the Queen, will deliver an address that will be broadcast around the world. The theme for 2019 is a connected Commonwealth, which offers opportunities for the people, governments, and institutions of this richly diverse family of nations to connect and work together at many levels through far-reaching and deep-rooted networks of friendship and goodwill. This year also marks the 70th anniversary of the formation of the Commonwealth as we know it today. What was once held together by colonial rule has transformed into an international community of nations in free association with old ties and new links, enabling cooperation towards social, political, and economic development, which is both inclusive and sustainable. To quote the Commonwealth Secretary General, the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland, at this time when multilateralism is under threat and we see nationalism and narrow self-interest on the rise, the Commonwealth shines as a beacon of hope and promise, inspiring confidence in the benefits of international cooperation and collective action. Commonwealth Day serves as a reminder of the awesome responsibility we bear to each other as human beings, and of the continuing importance of international cooperation and of the peaceful coexistence of nation-states, cultures, and peoples. I would like to conclude with the encouraging words of Her Majesty the Queen. We are able to look to the future with greater confidence and optimism as a result of the links that we share, and thanks to the networks of cooperation and mutual support to which we contribute and on which we draw. With enduring commitment through times of great change, successive generations have demonstrated that whilst the goodwill for which the Commonwealth is renowned may be intangible, its impact is very real. Happy Commonwealth Day, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last fall, I, along with the member from Hay River North, along with the Minister of ITI, was pleased to attend a policy discussion with the N.W.T. Manufacturers Association, focusing on the development of an N.W.T. manufacturing strategy. This is another one of our mandate commitments for this Assembly, and I was pleased to see that we are moving forward in this area. In particular, I was pleased to see new energy and ideas being generated from members of the Manufacturers Association. And giving credit where credit is due, I noted significant interest and responsiveness on behalf of the Department of ITI. Mr. Speaker, manufacturers in the N.W.T. face a number of challenges, factors that we're all familiar with. Like all of us, they face high energy costs. They face high costs of shipping. That hits them twice. First when they import raw materials, and then again when they try to market finished products. Recruiting, training, and keeping qualified staff is another challenge. Finding skilled tradespeople is not always easy, but important when compared to the demands of training and supervising unskilled labor. Then when a product is complete, who do they sell it to? Our territory offers a small market for the purchase of manufactured goods. Online selling is a good way to reach a wider market, but then to send their product elsewhere, they're faced with the shipping costs again. Facing these challenges, it may seem a difficult task to get a manufacturing initiative off the ground, and certainly it will be. Energy, commitment, and initiative will be needed. But there are ways in which the government can help alleviate those pressures, Mr. Speaker. We can support partnerships among manufacturers to achieve economies of scale. We can design training and apprenticeship programs to help workers find and match a skilled workforce with demand from employers. We can support research and innovation to reward new, made-in-the-North ideas and practices. We can assist with marketing to help manufacturers develop new markets for their products. Mr. Speaker, our greatest strength is the imagination, creativity, and resourcefulness of the people of the North. We can provide them with backing and resources to develop homegrown ideas and support this untapped sector to flourish and grow. Later, Mr. Speaker, I'll have questions for the Minister of ITI. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Trinidad.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to talk about an event that occurred this past Friday evening in the community of Deda, which was the Indigenous Cultural Gala that is being held to honor the grand opening of an artisan shop within the Chief Dragies Hall of the YK First Nations. This event truly showcased Northern art and creativity at its best. It featured a fashion show which provided an opportunity for Northern artists to collaborate and exhibit their homemade and handcrafted items on a runway. There were creations of all sorts, Mr. Speaker, from traditional vests to handmade earrings and necklaces. This event was an excellent demonstration of artisan collaboration which supported Indigenous makeup artists, hairstylists, musicians, a florist, a photographer, and clothing designers. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to share some of the names of the designers that contributed to the gala. The list includes designs from Berna Bolio, Leslie Ann Evans, Shauna McLeod, Sarah Plotner, Sheena Yakalaya. There are also designs from Charlene Chappell, owner of Heilani, Apparel, Tishna Marlowe of Denny Couture, as well as Sarah Erasmus from Erasmus Apparel. Also, Mr. Speaker, the musicians who performed at this event included Wesley Hardesty, who played the fiddle, William Greenland, who played the flute, and Casey Quazan, who performed with multiple instruments and audio-visual effects. Mr. Speaker, this event was only made possible thanks to a dozen of generous sponsors, a small army of devoted volunteers, and thanks to the entire staff of YK Denny First Nation who worked tirelessly on this event planning and coordinating. As a regional collective, the communities of Yellowknife, Deda, Dilo really came together in a positive way with the Indigenous Cultural Gala. It would be great to see this event become an annual mainstay with the cultural fabric of the Northwest Territories. Until the next one, Masicho, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week I delivered a statement on the concerns the Satu is experiencing with low numbers of graduates. Mr. Speaker, leading by a consultation process designed to engage all leaders, parents, and stakeholders is healthy in both strategic planning and development of an action plan. Last year, the Department of Education, Culture and Employment delivered the Canada N.W.T. Early Learning and Child Care Agreement and 3-year action plan. Mr. Speaker, I agree on the principles of prudent management in the area of Satu education reform. Advancing forward, a universal review session is long overdue, including reviewing the Education Act. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Education, Culture and Employment response to the Aurora College Foundational Review is establishing a vision for post-secondary education for the Northwest Territories, a common vision around education after high school. Mr. Speaker, I agree with these reformed engagements and initiated online survey for the public input. However, other venues can be reviewed for maximum outcomes, such as a Satu Regional Education for Symposium for Education. Mr. Speaker, it's not what the Government of the Northwest Territories Department of ECE can do for the residents and family. It's what the families and leadership can do for education. This forum would create a community-based dialogue and joint collaboration necessary for a modernized education action plan. Later, Mr. Speaker, I'll have questions for the Minister EC. Masi.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, last December the federal government released its framework on palliative care in Canada. The framework is a counterpoint to the 2016 introduction of assisted dying legislation. It identifies 4 priority areas for action intended to improve access to palliative care. They include palliative care education, training for health care providers and caregivers, measures to support palliative care providers, research and the collection of data on palliative care, and finally, measures to facilitate equitable access to palliative care, particularly for underserviced populations. The federal framework was developed in consultation with provincial and territorial governments, including our own. Now there's a federal framework. This government says it's examining how we could align our palliative care services. Our mandate for the 18th Assembly calls for the development of an action plan for expanded palliative care services, although the mandate tracker contains no information on progress towards this commitment, which is shown as underway. Achieving these alignments will require special accommodations within the service environment of our territory-wide system. Information on culturally safe end-of-life practices specific to the cultural context of the N.W.T. will be especially important, particularly in fulfilling the recent Cultural Safety Declaration of Commitment. In attempting to honor the desire for not only aging but dying in place, our far-flung healthcare service area will need to provide the ability to consult a palliative care clinical support network. Mr. Speaker, the needs of seniors are becoming more obvious as their population increases, whether it's in relation to the need for the increased supply of long-term care beds, housing support and programs under the Seniors Planning Study, or the increased demand on seniors programs and services. There's not much time left in the mandate of this Assembly, and I'm eager to see what progress has been made on the Palliative Care Action Plan commitment made under this mandate. I will have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Merci.
Merci. Member statement, Member Ike Godani, the Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I have the privilege of congratulating Irene and Angus McLeod of Fort Liard as they celebrated a combined 75 years of service to the N.W.T in the community of Fort Liard. Irene had begun working at the health center in Fort Liard since August 1993. Irene first began working as a housekeeper and then became housekeeping, receptionist, and clerical duties. Irene remained in this position for 10 years. Following this, Irene became the interpreter, medical travel assistant, and receptionist. When Irene was young, she aspired to be a nurse. However, the first time she assisted with the delivery, she realized that her dream of being a nurse may not be what she thought, as she started to feel sick during the delivery. Irene thought to herself, so much for that idea. Irene soon realized she needed to find something that she enjoyed. She shared and encouraged everybody committed to a long term. If you want to learn more, you have to teach it yourself and have the motivation and drive to excel. Angus has been employed at the health center and the custodial service for 35 years. When asked how to maintain successful long-term employment, Angus stated, if you want to work, work. Don't take time off. Angus shared he rarely, if ever, took time off. When asked what they enjoyed most about their work, Irene shared how she enjoyed meeting new people, interpreting for the elders. Angus shared how he enjoyed getting out and helping people. Irene and Angus were born and raised in Fort Liard. Both have 9 siblings. They are the eldest in their family. Irene and Angus met in Fort Liard in 1972 and married on December 20th, 1973. They have been blessed with 3 children, William, Lisa, and Clinton. They also have the privilege of 11 grandchildren, with a 12th on their way in May 2019. Mr. Speaker, Irene would like to express a heartfelt thanks to her grandfather for her success and drive in life, namely her employment. Irene attended residential school from the ages of 5 to 15. Her grandfather cared for her and was the one who revived her South Slavey dialect and has served her and the people of Fort Liard well. I would like to thank them very much for their service and encourage them to enjoy their retirement, since they have put 3/4 of their life together for the government of Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I rise today to make my 4th annual midwifery statement. The Northwest Territories midwifery program has had one of the longest gestation periods in the history of this Assembly, but now there's some good news to report. In response to my questioning during the Committee of the Whole review of the Department of Health and Social Services budget earlier in the sitting, there's now confirmation of new 2019-20 funding of $373,000 for 3 positions. One of them is a full-time midwifery clinical specialist and a 3/4-time midwife position, both in Yellowknife, and a 3/4 midwife position for Hay River. The total spending on midwifery for 2019-20 will be $1.789 million, which will be a very good investment with huge payoffs in deferred and avoided costs. For 2019-20, there will be a total of complement of 8.5 full-time equivalent midwifery staff in the Northwest Territories. The department says that this makes for one of the most robust midwifery programs in the country, measured against 15 total positions in Saskatchewan and the Maritime provinces, with a combined total of 13. The Northwest Territories midwifery program means mothers having children in their home communities with decreased travel costs, the benefits of pre- and postnatal care, and a health care model completely in tune with community health centers and reconciliation. Good news indeed. In applauding this program, I have to give a great deal of credit to midwifery advocates who have lobbied long and faithfully for results. We go back to the last Assembly in 2012, when public advocacy prompted the government to commission a midwifery review and expansion analysis report. Since then, I've personally attended at least 2 midwifery demonstrations out in front of this building. Although it has taken more than 7 years to get here, I also want to recognize the work of successive ministers of health and their staff, especially the current minister, who went to the well with what must have been a convincing business case to secure the resources to see this through. I'll have questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services later today about making sure we get this good news on midwifery out to all our citizens and publicly report on further implementation and progress. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have to give a shout out to the women and men of the Hay River Fire Department. Since yesterday, they've been working to contain a fire that flared up at the Hay River landfill, and for the past week, they've been working to manage the fire as it burned underground. For the most part, all of the firefighters have other full-time jobs and family responsibilities, so I'm sure many of them have had some long, tiring days over the past week. That's why I figured this would be a good time to show them some appreciation and thank them for helping keep our region safe. Mr. Speaker, we're lucky in Hay River. For decades, the Hay River Fire Department has set a high bar when it comes to training and preparedness. As a resident, it feels great to know that if I'm ever in a situation where I need to call an ambulance or report a fire, that there's a dedicated team ready to jump into action. I know it's not something that every community has, so I'm thankful and I don't take it for granted. In addition to responding to hundreds of calls each year and spending thousands of hours fighting fires, providing emergency medical services in town and along 800 kilometers of highway, and performing other emergency services such as the 24-hour flood watch in the spring, the members of the Hay River Fire Department find plenty of time to contribute to the community in other ways as well. Every year, they're present at the track and field championships, managing the medical tent, taking care of athletes and spectators, and helping out in other ways. On New Year's, they treat the community to multiple firework displays. During the Christmas season, they team up with the RCMP for the annual toy drive, where they collect and deliver hundreds of toys for children. And throughout the year, they also hold public safety events. Mr. Speaker, we're very lucky to have them. I know they're all busy right now, they're all tired right now, and I just want to let them know that their work is appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to visitors in the gallery, but more specifically, visitor in our interpreter booth. If I can ask Mary to just stand up for a few minutes. Mary Kudlock. I'd like to recognize respected elder Mary Kudlock from Holyoke. We are lucky to have Mary as an Inuktitut interpreter this week. Mary was born 30 miles east of Holyoke in a place called Anilac. She grew up in a caribou skin tent where they speared fish, wintered in snow houses, hunted seals through seal breathing holes. Mary has the same Inuit facial tattoos as her grandmother, Helen Kovac. Her tattoos were done by Hovac Johnson, who brought back traditional Inuit tattooing. Mary can be found ice fishing from March until July around the surrounding lakes in Holyoke. She has a fire pit outside her house where anyone is welcome to share her food, traditional food, her stories, and jump songs. Mary is a respected elder in the Northwest Territories, and many people look up to her as a mentor. She is an advocate of her official language, Inuktitut, and shares her passion and knowledge through the territory. Mary definitely does not see age as a barrier. This past weekend, colleagues, Mary completed the Ice Road Jigging Challenge, went for a slide down the Snow Castle ice slide, and sat on a Snow King throne. At this point in time, I'd like to say thank you, Mary, for all the things you do to keep our Indigenous language alive and for continuing to educate our youth about the traditional way of our people. Merci for all your services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have to give a shout out to the women and men of the Hay River Fire Department. Since yesterday, they've been working to contain a fire that flared up at the Hay River landfill, and for the past week, they've been working to contribute to the community in other ways as well. Every year, they're present at the track and field championships, managing the medical tent, taking care of athletes and spectators, and helping out in other ways. On New Year's, they treat the community to multiple firework displays. During the Christmas season, they team up with the RCMP for the annual toy drive, where they collect and deliver hundreds of toys for children. And throughout the year, they also hold public safety events. Mr. Speaker, we're very lucky to have them. I know they're all busy right now, and I just want to let them know that their work is appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to recognize my constituent, Mary Kudluk. Actually, Mary is a relative of mine. She grew up with my father in residential school in Kugluktuk, actually, I think in the 50s, so I'd like to welcome Mary to the legislature. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we miss anyone in gallery, thanks for being here with us. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Massey. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. First, could the Minister tell us the status of the mandate commitment on developing and implementing an action plan for expanded palliative care services? Massey.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that item is 4.2.1. We recognize, or rather in an effort to limit the number of action plans that we're developing, we've actually incorporated the palliative care work within the existing community continuing care services action plan. That's actually under item or objective 4 within that action plan. Palliative care is a component of home and community care, and this review is currently underway and will help to inform this services when they're rolled out and delivered. Also, Mr. Speaker, palliative care is also a component of the charting our course, the Northwest Territories Cancer Strategy 2015-2025, and we have hired a territorial palliative care specialist to work in collaboration with the authority, the Tlicho Community Services Agency, and Hay River to finalize palliative care policies, care pathways, and protocols for the implementation across the entire health system in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Nakita De Akasi, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, so I just have to make sure I understand what was said there. So this plan is becoming part of another plan, and the other plan is coming to us, I'm not sure when. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Continuing Care Services Action Plan has already been released. It's a public document, and objective number 4 is the area where we're focusing on some work in the palliative care. We're doing the home care review, those types of things that are going to help inform how we move forward in this area. But the charting our course, the Northwest Territories Cancer Strategy 2015-25 has also already been released, and we've already hired a territorial palliative care specialist who is doing a significant amount of work to help streamline palliative services here throughout the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Tata De Akasi, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering what advice the Minister took from families and people who have requested and used palliative care in the development of the provisions in the continuing care plan. Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the development of the Continuing Care Action Plan, we reached out to stakeholders across the Northwest Territories and got feedback from a number of them. With respect to charting our course in Northwest Territories Cancer Strategy, the Territorial Palliative Care Specialist is working with the different authorities and communities in order to streamline services and programs. Some of the things that we're looking at is helping individuals in smaller communities who have family members who might be palliative to support them in their own homes and communities. This may include support from community health nurses. It may include providing tools or resources, equipment that is necessary to help maintain that person in their home. And we are working where it's safe to do so to actually have individuals remain in their communities during their final days, but also when they need support as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Nundede Akasi, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, and finally I want to ask a question with reference to the Cultural Safety Action Plan that was recently released. Can the Minister tell us how the development of the palliative portion of the continuing care services plan included traditional knowledge and the healing approaches of all the cultures of the N.W.T. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the activities within the Continuing Care Services Action Plan are focused on ensuring culturally safe palliative care for clients and their families throughout the Northwest Territories, and staff are being supported to have cultural safety awareness training, and this includes obviously updating and adapting practices and resources and tools to ensure that they're contextually as well as culturally appropriate. And I know the member knows we recently released a cultural safety action plan, which would also be applied in all the work that we do in this area. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda County, the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in one of my communities, we have a couple that open their home to homelessness and people that are in need, and they do an amazing job, and I don't want to embarrass them, so I won't give them their names, but my questions are for the minister responsible for housing. Does the minister know of any programs that this couple can access to help improve their home so that it'll be a more warm and welcoming home? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I just want to thank the member for bringing this forward. I also want to encourage the member to have the family maybe contact our office through an email, and then I can share that with other departments such as Health Social Services, EC&E. Wouldn't be the first time that we've taken a interdepartmental focus on helping people out in our communities or even organizations. Would like to encourage also encourage the individuals to go and speak with their local housing organization or go into the district office to see what kind of programs they'd be involved in. But to get more of the details for the individual, any members that might come across such an issue, to contact me and send me an email, and then we can get the process started. But I do want to appreciate, as the member said, the family that is taking in people into their homes. It's unfortunate, and if there's a way we can help, we'll definitely look at that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Kidade, Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think the minister read all my questions over here and was able to answer most of them. So I understand an email, but will the minister be willing to work with me and the family to set up a meeting with his staff to do something like that? I mean, an email would work, but maybe a face-to-face would maybe be beneficial. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and yes, I'll definitely commit to having staff work with the member as well as the family, and but to get the ball rolling, to get things started and looking into right away, and to get me starting having conversations with some of my cabinet colleagues, I would encourage that the member work with the family to get an email sent to us with the details so we can look into how we can solve the issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade, Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister willingness to open up and get an email there and work with his colleagues. Does the minister know of anything that we can reach out and tell the family about right now through housing? Is there any homeless programs or something like that that we're able to work with? And this will be my last question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and really just get us a phone number even, and we can get staff to call the family and start working on what kind of programs they might be able to apply for. I don't know the situation fully, but we definitely want to help. But get us a phone number, get it to my office. We'll make sure that staff reach out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda County, the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following up on my statement to the Minister of Education here, my first question is, what role does the Early Childhood Education Action Plan play in supporting education in the Satu region? Merci.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Early Childhood Education Action Plan doesn't actually specify which regions. However, throughout all of the Northwest Territories on early childhood, we're providing, with the partnership in the federal government, we're providing the expansion of our distance delivery for our part-time early learning and childcare certificate program. So that's distance learning that can be provided to all communities. And as well, we have a full-time early learning childcare diploma program currently offered in Yellowknife. Of course, people would have to come to Yellowknife to access that, and we have student financial assistance available for that. We also have additional scholarships for people that are looking into getting into early childhood development. We used to have 10. With the support of the federal government, we now increase that to 30. And then, of course, we provide funding for junior kindergartens in all regions as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakeda de Akasi, member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that information reply. My next question is the Minister supportive of an education symposium in the Satu region? Thank you.
Masi. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So all of the education monies is actually provided to the education bodies, councils in this situation, sometimes authorities in different communities. So we're always more than willing to meet and to talk about anything education, but it would have to go through the appropriate bodies, which would be the Education Council at that point. If they're willing to organize it and fund it, then I would make sure that, of course, that we have staff from ECE to attend for sure. I think it's important. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tata de Akasi, member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that information here. I look forward to exploring dates of options here. There's the old saying, if you want to do something, you got to do it yourself, and I in this case, I don't feel comfortable with the authority that we currently have in trying to schedule this gathering. My next question is the Minister support of an education review for the Satu region? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to review all of the programs throughout the N.W.T on a regular basis. So I'm more than supportive of actually having an educational review, although I have to clarify that and state that we only have a couple months left in this assembly. I have already priorities on the table. I don't think that I'll be able to manage to do a review during this term, the rest of this term. So if I will put it on a transitional report, though, to state that there was a request to have an educational review, because I think if we're going to do it for one, we should be doing it right across our whole education. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Akasi, member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I know we're getting to the tail end of this assembly here, but I think we've got more than a couple of months. Could the vision, is the Minister willing to provide an assigned staff member to work with my office in scheduling dates that may lead up to the symposium? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
I didn't hear that right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I should clarify, it's my understanding was the question before was that if we do a comprehensive review on the whole education system, that isn't something that I could probably do in the next few months. However, we're constantly doing reviews of our education programming through our education renewal program. So that is an ongoing, that we're always looking at our programs, our education services, and they're always being reviewed on a constant basis. So I just want to clarify that it's not like we're not doing it. We do it regularly. But if you're looking at a full comprehensive one, that's a little bit differently. Having someone to work with the members in organizing a symposium. Like I said, if the member or the district council in this case is willing to fund and organize one, then I'm sure that I can get my staff to find a date that would work, that mutually work for all parties. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Ikeda Cannon, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ITI has undergone a few initiatives regarding manufacturing, and we have our manufacturing strategy forthcoming, of course. Last spring, the minister tabled a What We Heard report with regard to that strategy, and that had significant input from those interested in manufacturing, but also the minister and myself and the member from Hay River North met with those who are interested in revitalizing the Manufacturers Association. So, Mr. Speaker, finding and retaining labor is a challenge that is consistently shared among manufacturers. I'd like to ask the minister, what initiatives, if any, is the minister discussing with his other department colleagues to retain more skilled workers in the north, but especially around affordable housing and attracting people, Speaker?
Let's see. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we work very closely with the Department of Education on this matter, and a question like that probably would be better off served to going to the Minister of Education. But I can say on behalf of the Minister of ITI and our departments that the Government of Northwest Territories takes this very seriously. You can see that in our partnerships. You can see it with industry partnerships, with the mining industry and the Mine Training Society. How that's worked out, how it's linked to education, employment, and economic opportunities right across the whole territory for the residents. Partnership between our government and industry training provides and continues to help raise education awareness levels right across the territory. And I know this isn't specific to the strategy, but it definitely raises the awareness around how people can access these programs and the trade levels and the related fields and the benefits that come with these things. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the reason why I raised them, I appreciate that some of the questioning might be better suited for other ministers, but these are concerns, these are issues that manufacturers have raised directly with the minister, either in the What We Heard report or at a gathering that we had last fall. So that's the reason why I raised them today. When it comes to procurement, many challenges have been identified by manufacturers, but specific frustration has been expressed with the lack of consultation and rationale on changes to technical specifications that required manufacturers sometimes to retool or modify their operations. And so I would like to ask the minister, will the minister make a commitment that specification changes will be consulted upon with the respective manufacturers prior to making changes to those specifications? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Standing Committee has the manufacturing strategy in their preview, and I'm looking forward to the comments to come back from committee on that. But with that said, I think the issue the member is highlighting is one that has been identified in the past, and we've addressed it. We've taken a number of steps to improve the understanding and the application of our manufacturing policy, both to the manufacturers and to our N.W.T procurement departments, and I know that for a fact that we've done that. And so we've taken these steps. We've even taken the steps where we've sponsored facility tours and updated the manufacturer's product list and the specifications. And some of the members, I think actually the member even came on one of the tours with me on that. But I believe the one that he's highlighting specifically, actions that we're proposing within our strategy is going to help address this, because it's in there. We're talking about communication with the Northern Manufacturers Strategy and the capacity of the Manufacturers Association to interact with the Government of Northwest Territories. So again, I'm looking forward back from hearing from committee on their comments on this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for his reply. And yes, indeed, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment is looking forward to providing input with regard to the strategy. Mr. Speaker, many manufacturers describe the N.W.T's enforcement of both the business incentive policy as well as the manufacturing policy as being, quite frankly, unsatisfactory. A number of concerned representatives recounted instances which they believe policies were either misinterpreted, possibly ignored, resulting in arbitrary decision-making. So, Mr. Speaker, does the minister accept that these are legitimate concerns, and will he, let's say, revalidate the business incentive policy and the manufacturer's policy? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I believe we already have done that because that was identified in the Economic Opportunity Strategy in 2014, which led to our government to develop a strategy, and this strategy is with Standing Committee, and look forward to hearing their feedback, as I've said. The strategy that is with Standing Committee includes provisions for renewing the manufactured products policy by reducing the number of barriers and addressing past irritants to the sector. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nodere Cassie member, Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in discussions, a number of the manufacturers have identified information sharing as a concern. Many companies in fact said that they were unaware of the N.W.T funding and support programs for businesses. How will the department support better means of manufacturers to more easily access government resources, supports, programs, and funding? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism, Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member will know from reading this strategy, it is focused heavily on increasing the capacity of the Northwest Territories Manufacturers Association to be a voice for the manufacturers, and we'll continue to meet with them on a timely basis and make sure we get a lot of input for them as we move this thing forward. At the same time, we want to use this strategy to connect them with funding and training programs that are available to them. Just because you're in manufacturing doesn't mean you actually know about all these programs that are out there, so we're going to work on that with them. But we want to identify ways to expand their businesses, grow opportunities. But within this strategy, we're also looking at including an establishment of a Pathfinder position and the establishment of a reverse trade show and the development of a marketing plan and a website for made N.W.T products. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda Canyon, the member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the multi-year saga of NTPC's new diesel generators at the Jackfish Lake plant has finally come to a close. And I have questions for the minister responsible for the Power Corporation. Now that the generators are in fact delivered and the contract has ended, what are the final cost overruns for this debacle that taxpayers will ultimately be responsible for? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister responsible for Northwest Territories Power Corporation.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't have that information at my fingertips. I will get that information to the members, so I will take the rest of his questions as notice.
Minister has taken the question as notice. Oral question. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. In remarks in Committee of the Whole the other day, there is to be an additional $373,000 for midwifery in 2019-20, bringing the total resources devoted to midwifery to $1.78 million. There's to be a staff complement of 8.5 full-time equivalent people. Could the Minister of Health and Social Services summarize where these positions will be located and how services will be offered to other communities? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there already are a number of midwifery positions that exist in both Portsmouth and Hay River. The new positions that are being established, there's 2.5 positions in total. One of the positions is going to be the territorial midwifery clinical specialist position, and this position will provide some coordination and consistent program guidance midwifery services that exist across the Northwest Territories. They will also be responsible for engaging the clinical governance and quality assurance activities within the authority and liaise with Hay River Health and Social Services Authority for these exact same purposes. We also are establishing a 0.5 midwifery position in Hay River, and this position is going to be added to the existing complement, and this position will ensure the sustainability of the client or in the current services in Hay River, but we'll also do some of the groundwork for rolling out midwifery services and supports to communities like Fort Resolution and other communities in the Date Show. We also have a 0.75 position that we're establishing here in Yellowknife, and this position will work with the territorial midwifery clinical specialist and other primary health practitioners to lay the groundwork for integrated midwifery services here in the capital, but also for rolling out midwifery services throughout the rest of the territories as part of the territorial model. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that, and certainly interested in finding out more about how the services are going to be expanded to all our communities. I'm not aware of any plans to monitor and evaluate the new Northwest Territories midwifery program and publicly report implementation and overall progress. Can the Minister describe how the N.W.T midwifery program will be monitored and evaluated, and how the results will be publicly reported? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department has received approval for a monitoring framework that outlines a plan to monitor, the assurances at the following 3 levels. And there's 3 levels we're doing our work. The Legislative Assembly on behalf of the public of the Northwest Territories, the Department and the Authority. At the Legislative Assembly level, monitoring involves indicators of interest to the public, such as increased access to safe, qualified midwifery care as close to home as possible, and reporting at this level will be made public through the Legislative Assembly and through the Minister's Office. Department level monitoring involves indicators that show the territorial midwifery program is meeting best practices and standards, as well as in existence regular auditing mechanisms. And then the authority level monitoring involves indicators that inform authority leadership how to improve the quality and efficiency of programs. So there's multiple things that are being done to monitor the effectiveness of this program, to ensure that any enhancements and changes are evidence-based and in the best interest of the residents and the programs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that, and I would encourage him to share that framework with the Standing Committee. Families have been advocating for midwifery for years, mostly mothers such as Leslie Paulette, Wendy Leahy, and Joanna Timison. How will the role of these public partners be continued as we roll out these services and evaluate their delivery? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this, as the member so accurately described in his member statement, there's been a lot of work done on this, a lot of years, and there's certainly been a lot of advocacy in this particular area. Public feedback received through the 2017 midwifery stakeholder engagement process has informed the work of the advisory committee on midwifery to help develop the process and the approach to midwifery expansion. The advocates and consumers were specifically targeted in this engagement. The advisory committee, which included representation from the authorities and the Midwifery Association, are going to continue to provide input into the expansion process. The department will continue to work with the authority in the expansion of midwifery services, and will continue to work with clients that are interested in receiving these services to make sure that we develop a program that is strong and meaningful. To prepare for some of the regional expansion, the Hay River Midwifery Program, the department, as I said, has received some one-time funding from the federal government to start engaging communities, traditional knowledge keepers, and care providers in the South Slave and the Date-Cho region. And this work will just continue to lead to help bolster and strengthen midwifery services as we roll out a territorial program here in the Northwest Territories.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that information and his good work on the file. Lastly, I think I've done my part in trying to share some of the good news about a Northwest Territories midwifery program, but I think that a lot more could be done to promote this significant achievement. So can the Minister tell us what plans his department has to communicate and promote a Northwest Territories midwifery program? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a communications plan will be developed in collaboration with the health authorities to inform the public and other stakeholders of the expanded services and how this change will gradually increase access to services during the first few years of implementation. I do want to point out and note that expansion of the midwifery services is envisioned as a process that will be phased in over several years. This is year one of a multi-year rollout. And of course, it's going to be incredibly important that as we roll out different phases and steps, that we make sure the public understands what these services are, how to access them, and what benefits they will bring. So that will all be incorporated in communications plans as we roll out over the next several years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Massey, Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. And I'm following up on questions I asked about her budget in Committee of the Whole last week. First, could the Minister tell us whether the new ADM of post-secondary education is being paid by the college or being paid by the department? Massey.
Massey. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Associate Deputy Minister of Post-Secondary position actually will come out of the Aurora College funding. They do have funding for what used to be a president position, and this person will be taking on the role of overseeing the operations of the college. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, the Kidade Cassie member, Yellowknife Center.
Massey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, do I understand then from the Minister that the new ADM is the president of the college? Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, this Associate Deputy Minister is responsible for overseeing the operations of the Aurora College, just like the President's duties. However, this is an Associate Deputy Minister position. The main priority is actually bringing forward the framework. And then, of course, when that work is done, then that position will dissolve, and then a president position will be reinstated for our post-secondary Polytechnic University. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Tadade Cassie member, Yellowknife Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the last Aurora College report shows that they were projecting a deficit of $374,000. I do wonder if that's still the case, given the fact that 2 programs have been discontinued, the board has been dismissed, and the president resigned just a little bit into the new fiscal year. So is there money available at Aurora College to pay this position and related expenses? Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, yes, there's more money than I presume. So the money for the Associate Deputy Minister is budgeted already. It will come out of the monies that was allocated for a president fee. However, in 16-17, so the deficit that the MLA from Yellowknife Center spoke of was a year-end deficit, monies to be drawn down in that year. There was directions from the Education Department that you need to use some of that surplus, but the accumulated surplus for 16-17 was over $10 million, and the accumulated surplus for Aurora College on the 17-18 year was over $13 million. So they are trying to use it down to use some of the money. However, their accumulated surplus keeps increasing yearly, and then I'll be tabling a report in this week to show the latest surplus. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundida Cassie member, Yellowknife Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My temptation now is to bring out my wish list of education spending to help the minister with that colossal surplus. So are the surpluses going to continue because these positions are unfilled? And can Aurora College keep these surpluses as they occur? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So these are accumulated surpluses. They add up over the years. Like I said, I mean, the last one that was tabled here was 17-18. It was over $13 million. That money will be used for the Polytechnic University to assist with the implementation plan. Although, Mr. Speaker, I must qualify that that is one pot of funding. If there is additional funding that is drawn up, that is expected through the implementation plan, then I, as the minister or whatever minister in this position at that time, I'm hoping will be bringing forward that figure to the government to ask for additional funding. We'll be looking at monies from the federal government. We'll be looking at outside funds as well. So that's part of the comprehensive plan in developing this strategic work as we go forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a couple more questions for the minister. The first one is, how much is the budget for this position in the next fiscal year? Thank you.
Massey. Minister of Education, Culture, Employment.
Well, I mean, we've got privacy issues. Is she asking about the office budget?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So my understanding is that if she's actually asking for the salary of a person, that there may be some confidential issues on that. I am willing to meet with the member outside of the chamber to define that more in depth if she would like. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
She's asking for the office budget.
Oral question. Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me ask this question in a different way. I'm assuming that there's an office with an assistant, travel, contracting capabilities, and so on. What the line item that's called development of a polytechnic, how much is that budget for the next fiscal year? Thank you.
Minister of Education, Culture, Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do know that we give approximately $32 million to the Aurora College at this point. They provide a plan on how they're using that monies. I don't at this time have the exact figure that is for the Associate Deputy Minister's office, including travel, etc. Again, I can get that for the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Mr. Speaker, thank you to the Minister for that commitment. In order to increase transparency, can the Minister commit to creating a line item in the next budget which shows taxpayers what's being spent on the development of a polytechnic university? Massey.
Minister of Education, Culture, Employment.
Digging with finance.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will take that under advisement. I can't make that commitment on the floor. I'd have to talk with my colleagues in finance, etc., to find out what's confidential, what's not confidential, how we share that information. So it's a little bit more complicated than I'd like to make a commitment at this point.
Possibly, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
How can that be confidential? How much money it costs to create it? Sorry.
Do you have any more questions?
I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker. I was just digesting the information just given. Mr. Speaker, I guess I'm not understanding how spending on a government program could be confidential. It needs to be part of the mains, part of the program spending that we look at and review every year. So I would like the Minister to make a commitment that she will make this information public, if not today, then shortly. Massey.
Minister of Education, Culture, Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My understanding again, and I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm not right, is that there are certain areas that we report on. There's other areas that we don't report on so in depth because of confidentiality, such as line items. But the commitment is that the first couple of years we'll be developing an implementation plan to move us into a polytechnic university, and during that work there will be identified financial targets that will be identified in that work, and then also looking at partners, not only us, but all other partners also, to find that resources. So that will be part of the implementation plan, is the money needed to move it forward. Because there's more expenses than just a wage. There may be capital, we don't know, there's a lot of other things we may be looking at. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following two documents entitled Supplementary Estimates Infrastructure Expenditures Number 4, 2018-19, and Supplementary Estimates Operation Expenditures Number 4, 2018-19. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Massey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby table the draft Code of Conduct and Guide for members of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Wednesday, March 13th, 2019, I will move the following motion. Now, therefore, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that the tabled document 384-18(3) Draft Code of Conduct and Guide for members of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories be referred to the Standing Committee on Rules and Procedures for review, and that the committee report be presented to the Legislative Assembly during its August 2019 sitting. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Wednesday, March 13th, 2019, I will move that Bill 48, Post-Secondary Education Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Member for Hay River North.
Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Wednesday, March 13, 2019, I will move that Bill 49, Small Business Tax Relief Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River South, that Bill 46, Public Land Act, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. Motions not debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 46 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Yes, he's not. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that Bill 47, Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures 2019-2020, be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order, motions not debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 47 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River South, that Bill 47, Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures 2019-2020, be read for the second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill authorizes the Government of the Northwest Territories to make appropriations for operation expenditures for the 2019-2020 fiscal year. It also sets out limits on amount that may be borrowed by the Commissioner on behalf of the Government, including information on respect of all existing borrowing and all projected borrowing for the fiscal year, and authorizes the making of disbursements to pay the principals of the amount borrowed. Thank you, Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order to the principle of the bill. To the principle of the bill. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 47 has had a second reading. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move seconded by the honourable member for Hay River South that Bill 45 Corrections Act be read for the second time. This act repeals and replaces the former act. The new act focuses less on punishment and more on rehabilitation and community reintegration of offenders. Operational improvements are made, including in respect of risk management and security, quality assurance and monitoring, case management and programming, and staff training. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order to the principle of the bill. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 45 has had a second reading and is now referred to a standing committee. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters. Bill 2630, Committee Report 12-18.3, Minister Statement 131-18.3, 151-18.3, 158-18.3, Table Document 237-18.3, Bill 45. No, it's okay. And with the member Hay River North in a chair.
I will call the Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, committee would like to consider Committee Report 12-18, brackets 3, Standing Committee on Government Operations Report on the review of the 2018 report of the Auditor General of Canada on the Northwest Territories Child and Family Services. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We will consider the report after a brief recess.
will call committee back to order. We have agreed to consider committee report 12-18 brackets 3, Standing Committee on Government Operations report on the review of the 2018 report of the Auditor General of Canada on the Northwest Territories Child and Family Services. Committee report CR 12-18 brackets 3. The chair of the Standing Committee of Government Operations. Do you have any opening comments? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On February 26, 2019, the Standing Committee on Government Operations presented its report on the review of the 2018 report of the Auditor General of Canada on Northwest Territories Child and Family Services. The committee report included 13 recommendations, and I look forward to the opportunity to discuss the details of the report and the recommendations in committee of the whole today. Members of the committee may have individual comments apart from these, but I will not reread the extensive report we read into the record. Nothing further for now, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Does any members have any further comments? Recognizing Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm not part of the committee that produced this report, but I want to talk about how important it is. Government provides a wide range of programs and services to residents, but there are few as vulnerable as children who are in care. And it's not once but twice, as we know, that the Auditor General has pointed out the limitations and failings, quite frankly, of the response to children in care. I am aware that the Minister has taken this report seriously, and he has implemented a number of changes, such as those he reported on today in his ministerial statement. And I want to ask him to take seriously the committee's recommendations to make sure that there is a comprehensive approach to child and family services, and that we put this terrible chapter of failing children in care behind us and come to a place where we can be proud of the services that are provided, and that we can say with all honesty that we've done everything we can for children in care. So I may have also some specific comments as the recommendations fall out, but I wanted to make those comments at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Any further comments? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services incorporate into its quality improvement plan for child and family services the recommendations made in this report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Members, the motion is being distributed. Okay, Mr. Abernathy, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to the recommendation, we have read through the recommendations in this report. With respect to recommendation 1, we agree. The department values the work that has been done by the Standing Committee on Government Operations. Will certainly incorporate the recommendations that are not already covered in the quality improvement plan that are being made by the committee. A couple of them we have some questions about content and specificity, but in general we agree with incorporating their changes into our report. As we're going through each motion, I'll talk about each one and how we intend to incorporate it. In some cases, the recommendations already are in line with what we're doing in the quality improvement plan, so I will go into that detail as well. So, in principle, we agree with recommendation number 1, but as it is a recommendation to government, Cabinet will be abstaining. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion. Questions been called. All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that any government department, board, or agency being audited produce a draft action plan or implementation plan in response to the audit, provide the committee with a copy of that plan consistent with the appropriate process conventions, and present the plan at the committee's public hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion. Mr. Abernathy.
You should go to the mover first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion is similar to previous motions the committee has made in response to Auditor General reports. Every year we learn how to apply more specific language, and we feel this time we've got it right. The work of the audit function of the Standing Committee on Government Operations is crucial to good governance and serves the role of what would be called a Public Accounts Committee in other jurisdictions. And it's crucial that these reviews can be done to the best of the ability of the committee, assessing the best available information at the time. It's difficult to understand how a government is going to respond to the findings of an Auditor General report without a clear action or implementation plan that is preferably costed. So that's exactly what this motion is calling for. And this does not apply solely to the department that was audited in this report, but to all future departments and agencies that come before the committee. The Auditor General reports tend to be high profile. They tend to have important recommendations that the public is interested in. And if the committee is going to give the opportunity to raise the concerns in the report, the full range of analysis, deliberation, and comment, then we need to see exactly how the government intends to respond. So this recommendation is driven to achieve that point, that in the future, now we're moving to a cycle of 2 audits per year from the Auditor General's office, that when the departments appear before the committee, they will have something in hand for the committee to address. So the committee and the public has confidence that the recommendations of the Auditor General are in fact being delivered on. And further, the Standing Committee can then come back in 6 months or other intervals of time and say, you know, how far along are you on your action plan? Which actions have been implemented? Gives the committee the ability to check in on departments as they proceed to address the findings of the Auditor General. All too often, these reports can become one and dones. There's one hearing at a point in time, and that's the last you hear of it. We need to move away from that as an assembly and ensure the committees have more on their plates to constantly look at these systemic issues and make sure they're being addressed. So I encourage the government to take heed to this recommendation, and that in the future there will be comprehensive action plans and implementation plans in draft form made available to committee prior to a public hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Minister Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we accept that recommendation. And as a note, this Legislative Assembly has already agreed to develop some process conventions around this area. My one comment on it is I'd hate to presuppose the outcomes of that process convention. It seems like the member has already determined what that process convention is going to look like. I would say that we need some caution around that. I've been around for a number of years, and I've seen a lot of Auditor General reports come in, and not all of them asked for an action plan. So if we're developing process conventions that say we have to create an action plan, we may be creating work where we don't need to. But where action plan is necessary, if that is what the process convention says, that is something that we as a cabinet will absolutely abide by. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion. Question's been called. All in favor of the motion? Against? Abstentions? Passed. Mr. Tessart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services act immediately to ensure that all gaps in screenings and reviews identified by the Office of the Auditor General, including screening for guardianship agreements and foster homes, are addressed, and that it advise the committee when this is completed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tessart. To the motion. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I wonder if it's appropriate in this setting to ask the Minister whether he can report on this recommendation at this time. Is that possible?
Not at this time. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support this motion. However, I'm a little concerned that it reports to the Committee of GovOps instead of the Standing Committee of Social Development. That Social Development is the committee that will end up with this document after the Auditor General's report and direction will come to Social Development. So that is my concern with it. It should, it can be CC to Standing Committee of Government Operations, but it should go to Standing Committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Tessart?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll address the comments made by my honourable friend from Nahende. The committee's remit in this instance is to consider the report of the Auditor General and to, again, ensure that this is not a one-and-done process, that we remain in constant contact on these issues and to ensure that they are addressed. I appreciate where the member is coming from, but the committee does want to ensure that these recommendations are followed to the satisfaction of our findings and the satisfaction of the report of the recommendations made in this report. It's a small assembly. We work very closely together on both sides of the House, and I think we can ensure that the Standing Committee on Social Development is engaged in this, and certainly if that Standing Committee has the department and this issue and this area of the department's work within its own mandate, it can certainly act on that to inquire further. Our work is solely related to the Auditor General's report and the specific recommendations. I think there could be more work to be done on this issue, especially around this area. If the department completes this recommendation, then our work is done, but social development may want to reach further and develop more scrutiny on this area of child and family services. So I encourage the member who is chair of that committee to look into that. But I think it's important that the Standing Committee on Government Operations continue to pay close attention to the outcomes of the department's work in responding to the Auditor General's reports. And to the specific recommendation, Mr. Chair, there were very troubling findings in the Auditor General's report around screenings and reviews for, in particular, guardianship agreements and foster homes. And we want to ensure that those screenings have been done, because at the time of the issuance of the report, many had not been done. So this is about ensuring that children in these homes and in these agreements are safe, that the agreements are compliant with the relevant legislation and regulations, and that the department knows these facts are true. So with that, I encourage everyone to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tessart. To the motion, Mr. Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we agree with the Auditor General that all the foster homes must be appropriately screened, assessed, and reviewed by, and all supporting documentation be placed in the files to ensure the safety and well-being of children in foster care. We do take our responsibility to ensure that we are placing children with properly approved, trained, and nurturing foster parents very seriously. However, compliance with the standards that would assess those very things, as the members have indicated, was very low. The ongoing quality review process we have implemented will better monitor compliance to the standards that ensure proper assessments are completed prior to children being placed in foster home and allow for timely feedback to the frontline staff. New tools, Mr. Chair, are in place, Matrix, N.W.T, which includes checklists, reminders, and approval processes. This will support improvements to the screening and monitoring of foster homes. Improvements to the staffing and caseload, as well as training for both staff and foster parents, will ensure supports are available for prospective and future foster parents. Mr. Chair, the authority is taking a broader approach than improving the gaps found by the OAG in their screening reviews for foster homes. Example, the 37 files that have been raised previously. All open foster homes in the Northwest Territories are being reviewed in regards to address any gaps to ensure that children are being placed in homes with appropriate documentation and screening. The authority completed their first quality review for foster care service, which covered a 3-month period. The authority is working with each region and the TCSA and Hay River to develop and implement strategies to continue to make improvements and improve on compliance. Mr. Speaker, this recommendation, in my mind, also speaks to guardianship agreements and orders, and we accept that there was confusion and a lack of clarity in our standards around the role of child protection workers in supporting guardianship applications in the court. And this one really is about helping keep Indigenous families together, and this is something that I know the Honourable Member for Tunade and I heard loud and clear when we traveled throughout the Northwest Territories on our initial review of Child and Family Services. To ensure due diligence in transferring guardianship from the Director to a prospective guardian, a new standard has been developed that requires proper assessment to be completed in order to ensure the safety and well-being of child care. The standard identifies processes for assessing prospective guardians, financial support through voluntary support, service agreements, requirements for ensuring guardians understand their roles, and for situations in which guardians return children to the care of their parents. With guardianship, it is the parents who are the key decision makers in allowing their children to be placed with guardians. We did seek legal advice on whether Child and Family Services can screen new guardians where permanent custody orders have been withdrawn, and the guardianship order has been granted. For the cases identified in the Auditor General's review, the Department cannot retrospectively screen guardians once a guardianship has been assigned through a legal agreement, because once the Director is no longer the legal custodian of a child, Child and Family Services has no legal right to be involved with the family unless there is a new child protection concern. The standard we have developed makes sure that we're doing our work on the front end rather than having to come back at a later time. So we agree with the recommendation in principle. We look forward to making progress in this area. As it is a recommendation to Government, Cabinet will be abstaining. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I was hoping that there would be a bit of an opportunity to just speak in general terms about all the motions, and I just thought this would be as good a time as any just to speak in general about my own feelings about what happened with Child and Family Services and the auditor's report. I strongly feel that to follow the auditor's report to the T, it's not going to solve the issue. Unfortunately, the department has tried almost everything according to the Act to try to resolve Child and Family Services, but can't be resolved until we deal with the root problems that are facing Child and Family Services. So, and I just, maybe this seems to be out of place, but I just feel I had to speak up at this point, and it's in the auditor's report, a clear indication in auditor's report that there's 1,000 kids going through Child and Family Services, or through care or in some sort of care, whether it be care at home or care in somebody else's foster home. And 80% of those are related to alcohol. And I know that the department has an addictions plan. And what I'd like to see done is that addictions plan is amalgamated into the Child and Family Services first off, at the very beginning, to try to resolve the root problems. If we follow the Act, which I guess we have a legal obligation to do, but it'll make it a lot easier if we're dealing with families that are sober. Right now, and the Auditor General said it, I didn't know the number. I knew it was high, but I didn't know the number. And right now, we're looking at this number that the Auditor General put out, that 80%, or in other words, 800 out of 1,000 kids that are in care are because of alcohol, they're alcohol-related issues. And you look at that and it seems like just about everything stems from that. I'm a firm believer that kids in care are coming from homes from poverty. And that the poverty is something that we need to address in order for the families to stay together. I think I've said in the House, and it's not a comfortable thing to say, but I've said it many times, and it's because it appears as though some of these kids in foster care are in foster because their families are poor. And do poor families and poor parents have the right to have kids? They do, and they should be supported in order to keep their kids. And if poverty is the reason, if alcohol is the reason, we should address those root problems. And why are kids poor? Because there's lack of employment. You take a look at what's happening in our communities. There's low employment rates, and the kids come from those communities where there's low employment rates. And a lot of the kids, just based on the numbers, there can be a lot of kids out of Yellowknife as well. I realize that. For the mainstream people that have work, many double incomes or even one good single income, their kids aren't being taken away. For the most part, it happens. It happens to everyone. But for the most part, it's not happening. So it would be also good to take a look at what the work that's been done by the anti-poverty group, and again amalgamate that into the Child and Services Action Plan that's directed by the Auditor General. Maybe the Auditor General doesn't have all the answers. Maybe we have the answers as well, and some of the people in the communities, maybe they have the answers as well. And there's a part in there that I agree with a lot of what the Auditor General is saying, and a lot of what the Auditor General wants to do is they're good things under normal circumstances. But when you have a lot of alcohol involved and you have a lot of poverty involved, then those things won't apply. This is assuming that people were rich enough to be able to care for their kids, and it's all neglect. And they're losing their kids because of other reasons other than alcohol and poverty. And I feel that that's what it is. I also think that we need to start looking at the justice system and to determine how much of the guys that are incarcerated or are inmates that have come through the foster care system. And that's something that's important. I think we have to look at housing, and we have to take housing and make sure that the kids have proper housing. And I think that's I'm seeing this as a real opportunity for the government to have a real integrated approach with all of the departments. I know that culture, education, culture and employment is responsible for the employing, some employing or providing support for individuals, and I think that support should be sufficient so that individuals do get to keep their children at home. And I guess the last thing I just want to talk about that was in the Auditor General's report is the training of foster parents, and I think that's important in order to keep the foster parents in their home communities. The foster children in their home communities is to train the foster parents and find foster parents, and maybe some people don't think they're capable of being foster parents, and maybe they are. Some are not eligible, I realize that, but many can be eligible, and with proper training and proper supports, I think it's something that will actually resolve the issue. If we follow a plan that's developed according to what the Auditor General put out, we're going to probably fail. I mean, I'm not surprised that the Auditor General indicated that things got worse because, if you just follow a plan that's put together from the outside, then it's not going to work. It needs to be something that's got an approach by everyone, and we have to address the root problems that are facing us and that's causing us to take a lot of kids into care. So I just wanted to make those comments for the record, Mr. Chair, because I think that the next group would, if we just follow what the Auditor General said, I think the next group will be sitting here facing the same problems the next time the Auditor General does a report on child and family services for our territory. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. To the motion? Question's been called. All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services appear before the appropriate standing committee twice yearly to report on its compliance with the Child and Family Services Act and its progress on its quality improvement plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. Testart, proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, we've tread this ground already in this committee of the whole time. Which is the appropriate standing committee is really up to for the department to report on child and family services. It's really up to a given assembly. In this case of this audit, the responsibility is shared between two committees. However, the committee in this case wanted to create a recommendation that wasn't solely based on the audit findings, and this particular report, which although is deeply significant and concerning, is a point in time. The committee feels very strongly that future governments need to be on top of child and family services at all times. So this recommendation is hopefully binding for future governments, that they will come before whatever committee is charged with oversight and report on the general provisions of the Child and Family Services Act and how the system is supporting children in care, and any quality improvement plans that are currently underway. So for clarity, this is not, although this arises from our audit review, it is not specific to the audit and speaks much more broadly to the ongoing work of the legislature in its review of the Department of Health and Social Services as it provides support to families and children in care. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Start to the motion. Minister Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the remainder of this term, we will certainly provide reports twice yearly, as the report says. Given the desire of multiple committees to be involved, I'm prepared to send a letter with joint signature, or sorry, joint receivers So I'll send it to both the Chair of Government Ops and the Chair of Standing Committee on Social Development, and together we can work to figure out how to present, given that both parties are clearly interested. So we can work out those details going forward. And I will certainly recommend, by way of transition document, that that same commitment remain in the future governments. Depending on the structure that is established, we don't know what the committees will be in future governments, but I will certainly make that recommendation in transition that the briefings in this area go to the two committees responsible for these areas. The area responsible for Auditor General reports and the area responsible for social services. As a note, most quality reviews are completed on a quarterly basis, but they do require some time to put into reports. We do our system-wide audits every 2 years, but I'm confident that we will be able to provide meaningful data to the committees twice a year. So we accept it, we agree, but it is a recommendation to Cabinet, so we will be abstaining. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion? Question's been called. All in favor? Against? Abstain? Motion carried. Mr. Testart?
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services publicly identify performance indicators, including client-centered outcomes, that it will use to assess improvements in child and family services over time, and further, that reporting on these measures be incorporated into the Department's annual business plan and the annual report of the Director of Child and Family Services. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion is self-explanatory in what it calls for, but we were particularly seized with in identifying performance measures that were more than just output-based, such as amount of children in care versus children who have moved outside the system, something along those lines. Those are useful figures, but we really need a better understanding of the quality of care, and committee members felt very strongly that identifying very clear performance indicators, especially those directed at clients in the system, are the best way to understand the quality of the provision of services and not just the quantity of those services, for lack of a better word. As we know, governments report often. This government actually is quite proactive in many of its reporting requirements, or the information it chooses to report publicly. And those are good things, but often the issue is not the reporting itself, but what is being reported. So it's crucial that any reporting that's done incorporates these measurements, and that these measurements are included in basically everything the department does at a broader level, so that both the public and members of this Assembly, future members as well, can be able to look at a line or look at a report and clearly see how the system is functioning and whether or not it's functioning up to a standard that is acceptable as determined by legislation, regulation, and the public interest. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Testart, to the motion, Minister Abernathy.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we do agree with this recommendation in principle. As part of the Quality Improvement Plan, the Department has already committed to developing a set of key indicators. That's Action 1.5 in the Quality Improvement Plan that has been shared. The set of performance indicators are currently under development. Once completed, the Department will include these in future business plans as well as annual report of the Director of Child and Family Services, where they align with the scope of the plan. So they will be made public through those mechanisms. The Department will be seeking some legal advice to see to what extent the Child and Family Services Act allows for tracking client-centered outcomes within consideration for privacy and confidentiality requirements. And so what I mean by that, for example, is tracking some outcomes would require linking Child and Family Services data to other related measures such as hospitalization data, immunization data, and those types of things. This would also require the identification of common variables to link these data sets, things like child name and date of birth, healthcare number, etc. So if a healthcare number is required, as is often the case for a hospitalization data, the CFS system would need to start this information through, would need to track this information through the matrix N.W.T. Currently, the healthcare card number is not collected through this system, which could add some complication, which is why we agree with this recommendation in principle as opposed to straight agreement, because we have some work to do to determine whether or not we can actually do it to the degree that I believe the members want based on their recommendation. For other indicators related to measuring the success of youth once they have left or aged out, example things like employment or employment training, educational attainment, whether they're actually eligible to enroll in college, whether they're eligible to enter trade programs, these types of things. The department would have to verify with legal counsel if the Child and Family Services Act actually permits following children once their files are closed or locked for reporting purposes. Once that is confirmed, we need to go through what information is needed for data linkages. So while we don't agree that there's value in this to help make evidence-based decisions, we're not 100% sure that we can collect the data in the way the members would like us to. So our commitment is we'll do the work to figure out if we can, and if we can, we will. If we can't, we will certainly explain to committee what our challenges are and why we're unable. So that's why we agree with this in principle as opposed to just a straight accept. We have more work to do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion. Questions have been called. All in favour? All against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services incorporate into its Quality Improvement Plan on Child and Family Services a commitment to strengthen working relationships with Indigenous and community governments, and further that reporting on these measures be incorporated into the Department's annual business plans and the annual report of the Director of Child and Family Services. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think my colleague, the Honourable Member for Tinna-de-Willade, spoke around the complex nature of some of the the root causes that cause the intervention of Child and Family Services, and that there's really not a single solution. It's not, and I agree, it's not an Auditor General's report that's going to fix the problem. It's not expending millions of dollars without a plan. It's really the working with communities and figuring out where the strengths of those communities are and applying those strengths holistically so we can ensure the communities feel supported. With an overwhelming number of Indigenous children in the system, it's really beholden on this government to take action to engage communities to ensure that statistic can come down, and that communities are involved in the provision of these services for children. And the only way we're going to get there is if we start working together. And of course, with there's a lot of movement on this file, both nationally and here in the Northwest Territories, with signing of self-government agreements that include Indigenous governments offering child and family services. Even though the capacity to deliver those services may not be there today, it's important to start working together now so we can build a better system, both that the N.W.T operates and eventually Indigenous governments are going to operate. So we strongly support the government to strengthen. We acknowledge that there are already some of those relationships in place, but they need to be stronger. They need to be stronger so we can see better results, and so communities can feel engaged and involved in the system. So it's not an adversarial process, and it's one that speaks to the needs of communities as well as the needs of children in care. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Mr. Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we accept this recommendation. The Department is committed to this action in the Quality Improvement Plan, specifically in Action Item 3.5. Increased communication engagement of staff has been obviously an important focus for improving change management in all CFS strategic initiatives. The aim, obviously, is to bring decision-making closer to the front line and ensure that any quality improvement initiatives make sense in the context of frontline approach in the communities across the territories at the front line, in the communities where the children live. The department does recognize that it is important to engage with Indigenous government leaders, non-government organizations, as well as current and past clients. This will strengthen community capacity and help us move in the right direction to ultimately improve the outcomes for children, youth, and their families. To that end, Mr. Chair, I have directed the department to set up a teleconference with Indigenous governments for March 15th, as well as an in-person meeting for May 2019 to discuss how, together with our partners, we can strengthen working relationships with Indigenous and community governments. And Mr. Chair, as part of the reporting on Quality Improvement Plan, the department will track the meetings held with Indigenous and community governments, and we'll be in a position to report back to committee on those. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, there is a requirement in legislation to work with our Indigenous governments, and we are committed to that, and we will do that. As this is a recommendation to government, although we accept it, we will be abstaining. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy, to the motion. Questions been called. All in favor to the motion? Against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services incorporate into its Quality Improvement Plan on Child and Family Services a commitment to strengthen working relationships with community stakeholders in child and family services, including the Foster Family Coalition of the Northwest Territories and the extended families of children in care. And further, that reporting on these measures be incorporated into the Department's annual business plan and the annual report of the Director of Child and Family Services. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this is one of several motions involving kind of the frontline, workers and actors who are engaged in the system who might not necessarily be government employees. The committee recognized the enormous role the foster families and extended families play in support for children in care, and that their experience is crucial to making the system work. So we made a number of recommendations. This one's the first that calls for a strengthened working relationship with these community stakeholders. And many of our committee members come from or have experience with traditional backgrounds, and particularly in Indigenous communities. And we're very clear in asking for the committee to bring forward a recommendation that addressed extended families for children in care. Extended families can sometimes be a better option than other options that the government may identify, and working with those extended families can be a way to ensure that traditional knowledge is maintained, that common ties to language, culture, and tradition are maintained as the child continues to be in a system of care. So again, the committee feels very strongly that this holistic approach is going to ultimately achieve better results for children in care and result in better compliance for the government to manage its responsibilities under the Act. You'll note as well, Mr. Chair, that this recommendation also includes reporting conditions, and that's again so our committees, the current committees and future committees, and members of the public will be able to clearly see evidence of whether this is being done, and the government can be held to account as a result, and the committee can continue to monitor how successful these relationships are being in caring for children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, One would think that the Foster Family Coalition of the Northwest Territories would play a central role in the role of children in care, but it's my information that they don't. That information is not readily shared with them, and they do not, in fact, take a central role in advocacy and training for other foster families. There is an opportunity here with this resolution to increase the collaboration between the department and the Foster Family Coalition, and I urge the department to take advantage of that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. To the motion, Minister Abernethy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the department has reviewed the recommendation and does accept it. The recommendation is reflected in the quality improvement plan under sections 3.5 and 4.8. I also talked during my conversation around recommendation number 3, some of the work that we're doing with the Foster Family Coalition as far as tracking and working with them. The department and authorities also participate on a monthly partnership meeting hosted by the Family Coalition of the Northwest Territories, the Foster Family Coalition of the Northwest Territories. And as a note, the Executive Director of the Foster Family Coalition of the Northwest Territories is the co-chair on the Foster Care Quality Working Group that has been recently established. The Quality Working Group is focusing on how to improve relationships with all foster homes, including those with extended families. And as part of the reporting in the Quality Improvement Plan, and directly related to this recommendation, the department will track the meetings held with the Foster Family Coalition of the Northwest Territories and report on those. And we are working, obviously, to strengthen our relationship with the Foster Family Coalition moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernethy. To the motion, question's been called. All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Mr. Abernethy, or excuse me, Mr. Testard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services develop and implement training for foster parents. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. To the motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, the committee, in our deliberations around how we felt the issues that were raised by the report that really needed to be addressed, the role of the foster parents in the system and the government's working relationship with them really needed to be improved. Committee noted that there was not sufficient, the resources for providing training to foster parents was really insufficient, with many foster parents not having any formal training at all. So committee is very concerned by this and wants to ensure that anyone who's caring for children in the system has the adequate resources and understanding of their obligations under the legislation to be compliant and ensure that children are cared for, because that's really the priority, the top priority at the end of the day. And we feel very strongly as a committee that training supported by the N.W.T is required to ensure that foster parents have the support they need to be effective caregivers and guardians of children in care. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. To the motion, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this recommendation doesn't go far enough. The training should be mandatory. I understand that foster parents are often parents of children themselves, but being a foster parent is a different role. It requires different support and different skills, recognizing that children may be in their home temporarily, they may come from circumstances of trauma and neglect, and they may need special attention. So it would have been my preference that this motion say that the training was mandatory. And I think that it's really important to say that this relationship with the foster parents goes both ways. It's not just government demanding things from foster parents and providing them with training and so on, but also that foster parents are able to ask for help when they need it. And so for that reason, I would have preferred to see that this was mandatory. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. To the motion. Minister Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The department is actually already committed to this action in the quality improvement plan. Please take a look at item 4.6 or action item 4.6. The Foster Family Coalition of the Northwest Territories is currently engaged in this action item. I do take the member from Yellowknife Centre's point, and I'll certainly raise those issues with the deputy and the team working on this to see what additional steps may be necessary to make the training mandatory. And if we can do that, we will certainly look at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion. Question's been called. All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services establish an information sharing agreement with the Foster Family Coalition of the Northwest Territories to ensure that all foster parents may be connected with that organization's resources. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, this is one of our series of motions in support of foster parents in the Child and Family Services system. In this case, it's to ensure that information is being shared appropriately and effectively, so foster parents are not left asking questions or do not know who to go to for help. I take my colleague's point from Yellowknife Centre that it's a two-way relationship, and certainly the Standing Committee is very sympathetic to that concern, and wanted to create this package of recommendations that find new ways and more efficient and effective ways to support foster parents in the Northwest Territories. And we feel that establishing an information sharing agreement with the coalition will allow for better results and clearly define the boundaries of privacy. The Honourable Minister of Health and Social Services earlier spoke of the privacy concerns that arise from the often complex nature of these arrangements and of the children themselves in care. So it's important that everyone understands what their obligations are and what's appropriate within the broad terms of an information sharing agreement. So I look forward to hearing the Minister's response to this recommendation, but committee feels it's crucially important that the coalition be brought into the system, closer into the system, again, so we can ensure the system is as holistic and collaborative as it possibly can be. Thank you.
Mr. Testart. To the motion. Minister Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the department does accept this recommendation. As a note, this isn't something that was contemplated in the existing quality improvement plan in the way that it's articulated here. However, having read the recommendation, having read the report, the department will be adding this recommendation to the quality improvement plan. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion. Question's been called. All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services develop and implement mechanisms to enable staff to provide free and honest feedback anonymously. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, of course, I wouldn't call this so much whistleblowing as more a way to support staff who are in very trying circumstances. We've heard the concerns around the burden of reporting, the limited resources, the limited number of staff to work with. I recognize there's some new money going into creating some new positions that should help. But for those people who do feel like either the policy environment or other issues may arise. They need to have a conduit for that information to flow to the relevant authorities and to ensure that they feel safe in disclosing that information. And this recommendation calls on the government to establish a means to do that. And rather than rely on a larger government approach like the process that's laid out in the collective agreement, this calls on something specific to Child and Family Services and to the social workers and other staff who are engaged in the system. So a specific protocol, a specific mechanism for Child and Family Services that doesn't rely on broader measures that might be in a collective agreement or in legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Minister Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the department has reviewed the recommendation and we accept it. Just as a note before I go into comments specifically about the recommendation, the N.W.T does have a safe disclosure policy, and I understand the members' suggestion that there needs to be something other than that, but I do strongly encourage staff, if they feel that there's something going wrong or something not working the way it should, they've always got the opportunity to use the safe disclosure policy. With respect to this recommendation, the department does agree with the recommendation and has already actually implemented an anonymous feedback process for staff, including an anonymous Child and Family Services suggestion box, and that was done in September 2018. It's actually action item 1.17 in the Quality Improvement Plan. The web link to the suggestion box is included on the monthly all CFS staff meeting invite, so everybody that's getting invited to that meeting gets to see the suggestions that have been made, so that they can have discussions around those suggestions and or comments in order to affect change in how we're doing our services. The monthly all CFS staff teleconferences is actually being used as a reporting mechanism for the anonymous suggestion box, and that to date I can say that suggestions received have actually informed the development of the Quality Improvement Plan, so it's feedback from staff that is making a difference. The department and the authority also provide anonymous surveys for our participants of all of our training events. For example, the CPW core training, we've got supervisor and manager annual training, we've got assistant director training, and those trainings are identified in action item 1.18. This information that we get, which is anonymous, is used to improve subsequent training events and develop comprehensive training frameworks, which is articulated in action item 1.11. We do recognize that staff need to feel comfortable in sharing meaningful feedback, and we are working to build an organization culture that supports exactly what I feel the members are asking us to do. So, although we agree it is a recommendation to government, Cabinet will be abstaining.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion, questions have been called. All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Motion passed. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services incorporate into its Quality Improvement Plan for Child and Family Services a clear commitment to complete the assessment of financial and human resources required to deliver child and family services as recommended by the Auditor General of Canada, and further that this assessment incorporate gender-based analysis, example via the Gender-Based Analysis Plus tool, and furthermore, that the department share with the committee its project plan for this work, developing subsequent timelines in discussion with the committee, and furthermore, that the Quality Improvement Plan for Child and Family Services be revised and re-released to reflect this assessment upon its completion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a kind of long-standing issue that's been raised by previous reviews of Child and Family Services. The Child Welfare League was asked to do some work on this in the past after the last Auditor General report, and it stubbornly remains, I think, a stumbling block to really understanding how to solve some of the deficiencies within the provision of Child and Family Services. In the budget, the 2019-20 budget, there's $3.5 million additional dollars, and my concern at the time, and it continues to be a concern, is we know that money can be used, but we don't know how effective it will be. And I have heard many many of my colleagues opposite say time and time again that more money does not necessarily solve problems, and committee couldn't agree more, which is why this recommendation calls for a clear assessment of the financial and human resources required. And I know that that is not an easy subject matter. This is an issue across Canada. There's no hard and fast scientific-based formula on what is perfect, but we have to do something, and we have to do something that's more than what we're doing now. Further, we've made the recommendation incorporate gender-based analysis. We feel that's an important consideration to make in the provision of these services, and that it needs to be a part of the government's work. And finally, that whatever work comes out of this assessment, that it reevaluate the plan as a result of that. That we feel very strongly as a committee that this action plan must address this issue, because this is not the first time it's been raised. And if we're ever to understand what the system actually needs to operate as effectively and efficiently as it needs to ensure the protection of children in care, this assessment is absolutely required. So I hope that the government will meaningfully accept this recommendation and do the work that's being asked of them, and that ultimately the quality improvement plan will reflect this in its final version. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. To the motion, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, it's hard to overstate the importance of this motion. It is the key motion of all that have been made here. It builds, as my colleague said, on a request that goes back almost 20 years to try to quantify caseloads and workloads for people providing services to families and children who are in care. It's important not only that the government use this information to catch the system up to where it is now, to where it should be now, to provide the full range of services, but also there's a plan that will guide the government into the future about the resources that are required. And so for this reason, it's absolutely essential that this work, although often attempted and incomplete, this time be completed and reported on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. To the motion, Minister Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the department has reviewed the recommendation, and we agree with the OAG as well as the committee that addressing workload capacity within the CFS system is critical, absolutely critical, in ensuring the delivery of appropriate services to children and families. The department has recognized capacity challenges related to workload and caseload issues in the regions. And in February 2019, just a few weeks ago, the Minister of Finance released the proposed budget for the 2019-2020 fiscal year, which, as the member indicated, included $3.3 million investment to add 21 new positions to support child and family services. Mr. Chair, let's be clear, we know that we need to make sure that we have the staff we need to meet children and family services needs now, but also into the future. And we are taking actions to strengthen the recruitment and retention and development of CFS staff across the Northwest Territories. Mr. Chair, the department absolutely recognizes the need to conduct the assessment, and this is absolutely reflected in action items 1.9 and 1.10 of the Quality Improvement Plan. If applicable, the department will incorporate, we will incorporate the Gender-Based Analysis Plus tool. Staff is currently taking the Gender-Based Analysis Plus course to determine how this type of analysis will impact the assessment of human and financial resources for a child and family services system. So based on this additional requirement, the department will be extending the deadline for this deliverable to June 15th, 2019, so a little giving us a bit more time to do that work. And the department absolutely agrees to share its project plan for this work with committee and share a revised quality improvement plan based not only on this recommendation but all the recommendations, and we will certainly get that to committee as soon as we can, recognizing it does take us a bit of time to incorporate the recommendations that are being identified. But we agree with this recommendation in principle, and we're going to do the work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion, question's been called. All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Motion carried. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Health and Social Services develop and implement caseload standards for child protection workers by June 30th, 2019. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So similar to the last, this is a long-standing issue that has only been partially completed in previous responses to these findings. It's crucial that we have a better understanding of how many cases an individual child protection worker should be undertaking, and what capacity looks like in a very high stress demanding job. And what the supports look like as well. We can't get to the issue, we can't just get to the resource in question without identifying a standard for caseload. And this is such a crucial, long-standing issue that the committee has placed a firm date in this recommendation, and the committee's expectation that should this motion carry, the government will follow suit and deliver this new standard by June 30th. And at the very least, respond to our concerns sooner than that if they cannot meet that deadline. But it is crucially important that caseload standards be developed and implemented for child protection workers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion? Minister Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this is one of the recommendations that we agree in principle as opposed to accept. As outlined in the response to the Auditor General, the Department does plan on actually developing the caseload standards for child protection workers. However, the deadline of June 30th, 2019 would be premature to establish the standards. This is based on a number of things, but specifically, as we move forward and look at new resources that will be rolled over the next 3 years, the Department is also going to test proposed caseload standards to ensure that they're appropriate. I mean, we could put in a standard which is an academic exercise, but until we test it to make sure that it's exactly right and does take into consideration that we're not just going to be providing services with one type of professional, child and family service worker, we're looking at family preservation workers, we're looking at other support type positions. There'll be a variety of types of positions. It's not going to be the day of just having one type of position doing this work. It's a little premature to come up with a solid and fast standard. We believe we need some time to test, monitor, evaluate, and evolve this standard, recognizing the range of types of positions that we would be looking at. So although we agree that this needs to be done and we're going to do it, we're not confident that we can give the committee a hard and fast, this will be the plan forever caseload number on June 30th. We are going to take more time. We need more time. I do accept there's urgency. I do accept that this is something that needs to be a priority, and it is. We just, the timeline that's provided is we don't feel that we'll be able to do it and get it right. So we're going to take more time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. To the motion. Questions been called. All in favor? Against? Abstentions? Motion passed. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Government of the Northwest Territories provide a comprehensive response to this report within 120 days. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion.
Question.
Against? Abstentions? Motion passed. Thank you, committee. Do you agree that we have concluded consideration of committee report CR 12-18(3), titled Standing Committee on Government Operations Report on the Review of the 2018 Report of the Auditor General of Canada on the Northwest Territories Child and Family Services? Agreed. Thank you, committee. We have concluded consideration of committee report CR 12-18 brackets 3. What is the wishes of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. I shall rise and report progress. To the motion? Thank you, committee.
May I have the report, Member Satu?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Committee Report 12-18 brackets 3 and would like to report progress with 13 motions carried, and that Committee Report 12-18 brackets 3 is concurred with. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the committee report to the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Grey Slave. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carries. Massey. Third reading of bills. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that Bill 31, the Northwest Territories 911 Act, be read for the third time. And Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote. Thank you.
Massey, member requested for a recorded vote. Motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor, please stand.
Member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South, the member for Inuvik Twin Lakes, the member for Hay River South, the member for Tabacha, the member for Hay River North, the member for Mackenzie Delta, the member for Satu, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunada Wellade, the member for Nahende, the member for Frame Lake, the member for Yellowknife Center, the member for Decho.
Merci. All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand. The results of the recorded vote, 17 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. The motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Yellowknife South, that Bill 47, Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures 2019-2020, be read for the third time. And Mr. Speaker, I would request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member requested for a recorded vote. Motions in order. To the motion. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Today is the final step in a very long and time-consuming process that began in September 2018 with a 3-week review of the departmental business plans. Committee of the Whole reviewed the 2019-20 main estimates for 12 government entities from February 20th to March the 8th. We have received replies from ministers for, I think, 3 of the departments reviewed so far. Surprises go to the Minister of Infrastructure, and the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, and the Minister responsible for the Housing Corporation. I look forward to receiving the additional information from the other responsible ministers, as this should have been received in advance of the appropriation bill we are dealing with right now. For the 4th year in a row, no public consultation was carried out with regard to the budget. Despite my previous recommendations, there were no consultation with regular MLAs to help set priorities and develop the business plans. Cabinet dropped in very significant changes from the business plans to the main estimates in the order of more than $20 million with no explanation. We had to ferret out these changes and seek additional information. Further changes came to light on the floor of this House in Committee of the Whole. For example, Environment and Natural Resources restructured itself internally and reallocated its budget cuts, but provided no notice or revised budget documents for members to base their departmental review upon. I'm still waiting to see that information. Thanks to our colleague, the member for Yellowknife Centre, we now know that the budget for post-secondary renewal and the Associate Deputy Minister leading that effort is buried somewhere in the Aurora College appropriation. While I strongly support our move towards a polytechnic university, there should certainly be a clear and transparent budget for that work. What I learned during the main estimates review, there are definitely some good initiatives in this budget, including a $3.3 million for Child and Family Services, a territorial midwifery program, and increased resources for autism. Some of the money for the new initiatives is being taken from some other programs, including $600,000 cut to home care services funding. The Minister of Justice has made a sincere commitment to carry out a comprehensive review of victim services. I look forward to the results and increased resources and support for these important programs and staff. Additional funding for family violence shelters is also much appreciated. 911 emergency services are proceeding, and that is a good thing. A lot more work is needed to achieve the July 1st, 2019 implementation date. I support legally binding land use planning in the Wekajee management area. A plan can assist with recovery of our caribou herds through habitat protection. However, I remain concerned that the federal government is not living up to its obligation to fund this effort. I urge Cabinet to work with the Tlicho government to bring the federal government to the table and invoke the dispute resolution process in the Tlicho agreement to settle this matter. Cabinet has no intention of reviewing the Heritage Fund Act as laid out in the mandate. The fund continues to lose money against inflation, and the plan now seems to be to contract out its management rather than provide a role for the public in managing the Heritage Fund. A very large information system services information systems shared services unit of over 70 staff is being created with many transfers from other departments. The purpose appears to be to centralize control within the Department of Finance rather than improve client services. There's no monitoring evaluation framework, but the Minister is now committed to share that framework and a progress report with regular MLAs. Environment and Natural Resources is the only department that continues to take cuts in 2019-20 to the tune of another $1.67 million. During the term of this Assembly, funding for the department has been slashed by 10%. If there was ever any doubt that the environment is not a priority with Cabinet or the Minister, this is the evidence. Very significant delays have been experienced in getting mandate commitments completed and other work as well. This is not because of the lack of dedication by the hardworking staff, but a lack of resources and leadership. Responsibilities have increased with climate change audit, pan-Canadian framework obligations, the caribou crisis, and new legislation developed without additional resources. But funds continue to shrink for the department. The ENR Minister has not been able to protect this department or secure additional resources from his friend, the Minister of Finance. I'm profoundly disappointed to see that there is no new funding to address the caribou crisis. There are legal requirements for recovery strategies for both boreal and barren ground caribou, as these are now classified as species at risk. There's always money for roads, as we will see with the supplementary appropriations later this week, but nothing for caribou. That says it all, Mr. Speaker. A road into the Slave Geological Province is untenable and not responsible development when there is a caribou crisis with no new money to help with the recovery. I was astounded to learn from the Minister of Infrastructure that when it comes to federal funding, the Slave Geological Province Road is a higher priority than the replacement of the Frank Channel Bridge. Planning for a new road should not take priority over public safety. Without a safe Frank Channel Bridge, there is no Slave Geological Province Road. There has been some progress on increasing community government funding by $1.8 million in 2019-20, but we still need the plan to close the gap in the 2015 municipal funding review. Back then, it was a $33 million shortfall, so this also needs to be updated based on our current needs. There's no plan for having a single window service center in all of our communities. The Minister has resisted calls for such services in regional centres and Yellowknife, despite collaborative opportunities with Service Canada. Little to no progress on land rights negotiations has taken place during the 18th Assembly, and I don't expect that any final agreements will be signed before the fall. For a government that says it is committed to Indigenous rights and reconciliation, there is so little to show. Little to no progress in contaminated sites management and prevention of public liabilities has occurred, and that was also a mandate commitment. Most of the work should be done by the Department of Lands. Some sort of tracking system has yet to be completed, and a manual on contaminated sites management has been in preparation for what seems like years. There's been no new policy developed, regulations, or completed legislative changes to ensure that we reduce the risk of taking on new public liabilities. Over the last 4 budgets, I've offered some thoughts on how to improve the budget process, including early and meaningful consultation with regular MLAs and the public. I've also recommended a more balanced approach that includes more revenues and a stronger focus on diversifying our economy. Transformative change can come through the emerging knowledge economy and opportunities such as the conservation economy with Thaidene Nene. We need solid plans and investments for adequate housing and universal childcare so our residents can engage in the economy. We need to get our housing out of core need while creating local jobs. We need to provide stronger support for the arts, tourism, agriculture, and the fishing industry. We must reduce greenhouse gas emissions, lower the cost of living, and develop a real post-secondary education system. These sectors also create more jobs than non-renewable resources development per dollar of investment. That's the kind of leadership I'd hope for in this budget and the main estimates. I was very pleased to work with my regular MLA colleagues to get some very modest improvements in this budget. While I appreciate and can support many of the activities, programs, and services and some of the new initiatives in this budget, the lack of priority for the environment, housing, and economic diversification continues to move the N.W.T in the wrong direction. I will not be supporting this budget or the appropriation bill. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. To the motion. To the motion. Question's been called. Member requested for a recorded vote. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Inuvik Twin Lakes, the member for Hay River South, the member for Thabacha, the member for Mackenzie Delta, the member for Satu, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunada-Welladay, the member for Nahende, the member for Yellowknife Centre, the member for Decho, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South.
Merci. All those opposed, please stand.
The member for Hay River North, the member for Frame Lake.
All those abstain, please stand. The results of the recorded vote, 15 in favor, 2 opposed, 0 abstention. The motion is carried. Merci. Bill 47 has had a third reading. Third reading on bills. Third reading on bills. Mr. Clerk, will you ascertain as whether Her Honor the Commissioner of Northwest Territories is prepared to enter the chamber to assent to bills?
Please be seated. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker, members of the Legislative Assembly. Good afternoon. As Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, I'm pleased to assent to the following bills. Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act. Bill 32, Naturopathic Profession Statutes Amendment Act. Bill 47, Appropriation Act, brackets, Appropriation Expenditures, bracket, 2019-2020. Masicho, thank you. Kwana Nami, merci beaucoup, Kwana.
Order. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Tuesday, March 12, 2019, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, reports of standing and special committees, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, Bill 44, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Bills 26 and 30, Minister Statements 131, 151, and 158-18.3, Table Document 237-18.3, Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Yeah, Mr. Clerk. Did that's idea na hote onde in that's idea de na kids na Hudson de March 12, 2019 in Shatani de.